Margaret Whitmore stood in front of the small, cracked mirror in her tiny room. The glass showed a woman who looked tired, much older than her 42 years. Dark circles hung under her brown eyes like shadows that never left. Her once thick hair had started showing silver threads, and worry lines had carved themselves deep into her face. The room around her was barely big enough for a bed and a small wooden table. Peeling wallpaper hung from the walls like old skin, and the single window looked out onto a dirty Boston alley where cats fought over scraps. This boarding house was all she could afford now. Actually, she couldn't even afford this much longer. On the table sat a half-written letter that had been tormenting her for weeks. Next to it lay a newspaper clipping that had changed everything. The advertisement was simple but felt like a lifeline to a drowning woman. Honest rancher seeks good woman for marriage. Must be of sound character and ready for frontier life. Age 25 to 35 preferred. Write to Thomas McKenna, Cedar Ridge, Colorado Territory. Margaret picked up the letter she'd been writing and read her own words again. They felt like lies burning on the paper. She had written that she was 34 years old. 8 years younger than the truth. 8 years that felt like a lifetime when you were desperate. Her real story was nothing like what she'd written. 6 months ago, she had been Mrs. Robert Whitmore, wife of a respected banker. They lived in a nice house with servants and fine furniture. Margaret wore silk dresses and attended charity events. Life wasn't perfect, but it was comfortable and safe. Then Robert died suddenly of a heart attack. That's when Margaret learned the terrible truth. Her husband had been gambling away their money for years. Not just their savings, but borrowed money too, lots of it. When the debts came due, everything had to be sold. The house, the furniture, even her wedding ring. It still wasn't enough. The men who came to collect the money weren't the kind who forgot about debts. They gave her 2 weeks to find the rest of the money or face consequences she didn't want to think about. That was 3 days ago. Margaret had no family left. Her parents died when she was young, and she never had children with Robert. Her so-called friends disappeared the moment they learned about the debts. In Boston, she was nobody with nothing and nowhere to go. She sat down on the creaky bed and picked up her pen again. The lies felt heavy in her hand, but what choice did she have? If she wrote her real age, would this rancher even consider her? Most men wanted young wives who could give them children and work hard for many years. At 42, she was past the age most men thought useful, but she wasn't ready to give up on life. She still had strength in her body and love in her heart. She could cook and clean and take care of a home. She could be a good wife to a good man. If only someone would give her the chance. The problem was getting that chance. Margaret looked at the letter again. She had written about being a widow, which was true. She wrote about being alone in the world, also true. She described herself as hardworking and honest, which she had always been until now. The only lie was those 8 years. Just 8 years. Was that so terrible when measured against dying poor and alone in this awful place? She tried to imagine what this Thomas McKenna might be like. A rancher in Colorado Territory would be a rough man, probably. Hard hands and a weathered face from working under the sun. Maybe not educated, but hopefully kind. She didn't need romance or passion anymore. She just needed safety and a chance to matter to someone again. The newspaper advertisement had been posted 2 weeks ago. How many other women had already written to him? Young women, pretty women, women who wouldn't need to lie about their age. Margaret felt her chances slipping away with each day she hesitated. She stood up and walked to the window. Down in the alley, a woman about her own age was digging through garbage, looking for food or anything valuable. Her clothes were rags and her hair was dirty and tangled. Margaret could see her future in that woman's desperate movements. That decided it. Margaret sat back down and continued writing the letter. She described her late husband's work, but said he was a store clerk instead of a banker. She wrote about keeping house and cooking meals. She mentioned that she could read and write well, which might be useful even on a frontier ranch. Then came the hardest part. She had to create a history for the 8 years she was erasing. What had she been doing when she was supposedly 26 instead of 34? She decided to say she had married young and been widowed for several years. It was close enough. To the truth to feel comfortable saying dot as she wrote, Margaret found herself actually thinking about this man she'd never met. What made a rancher place an advertisement for a wife? Was he lonely out there on the frontier? Had he loved someone before and lost her? Did he sit by his fire at night and wonder if he'd spend the rest of his life alone? The questions made Thomas McKenna seem real to her, not just an escape route but an actual person. Someone who might need her as much as she needed him. The thought gave her the courage to finish the letter. She read it through one more time. The words looked good on paper. They painted a picture of a woman who would make a suitable frontier wife. Not too fancy, not too demanding, but decent and capable. The woman in the letter was someone Thomas McKenna might actually want to marry. Margaret folded the letter carefully and put it in an envelope. She wrote his address in her best handwriting and sealed it with a drop of candle wax. The letter felt light in her hands, but it carried the weight of her entire future. Walking to the post office took 20 minutes through Boston's busy streets. Margaret clutched the letter tightly, afraid she might change her mind and turn back. People hurried past her without a second glance. In her simple dress and worn shoes, she was invisible to them. Just another poor woman in a city full of them. At the post office, she paid for the stamp with coins she had been saving for food. The clerk took the letter without interest and tossed it into a large bag with hundreds of others. Margaret watched it disappear and felt like she was watching her old life end. Walking back to the boarding house, she tried to imagine the letter's journey. It would travel by train across the country, through states she'd never seen, to places she'd only read about in books. Someone would carry it to a ranch in Colorado Territory, to a man who might become her husband. Back in her room, Margaret sat on the bed and looked around at her few possessions. A small suitcase held 2 dresses, some undergarments, and a few personal items. That was all she owned in the world now. If Thomas McKenna wrote back and wanted to meet her, she would be ready to leave Boston forever. The waiting began that day. Every morning, Margaret checked for mail, hoping for a letter from Colorado Territory. Every evening, she went to bed wondering if she'd made a terrible mistake. But she'd taken the first step toward a new life, even if that step had been built on a lie. 8 years didn't seem like such a big deception when the alternative was giving up on everything. Margaret told herself that if Thomas McKenna turned out to be a good man, she would find a way to make up for the lie. She would be the best wife she could be, age and all. The die was cast. Now all she could do was wait and hope. 2 weeks felt like 2 years. Every day, Margaret walked to the boarding house lobby to check for mail. Every day, the clerk shook his head with the same bored expression. She began to think her letter had gotten lost somewhere between Boston and Colorado Territory. Or worse, that Thomas McKenna had read it and decided she wasn't worth answering. Then, on a rainy Tuesday morning, everything changed. "Letter for you, Mrs. Whitmore," the clerk said, holding up an envelope with her name. Written in careful, strong handwriting, Margaret's hands shook as she took it. The return address read, T. McKenna, Cedar Ridge, Colorado Territory. Her heart beat so fast she thought it might burst. She carried the letter up to her room like it was made of gold. Sitting on her bed, she opened it slowly, afraid of what she might find inside. "Dear Mrs. Whitmore," it began. "Thank you for your thoughtful letter. I was pleased to hear from a woman of good character who understands the challenges of frontier life." Margaret smiled for the first time in months. He had written back. That had to mean something good. The letter continued in the same careful handwriting. Thomas McKenna wrote that he was 38 years old and had been running his cattle ranch for 10 years. His wife had died 2 years earlier during childbirth along with their baby. Since then, he had been managing the ranch alone with help from 2 hired hands. "The work keeps me busy during the day," he wrote, "but the evenings are long and quiet. A man gets to thinking too much when he's alone with just cattle and horses for company. I find myself talking to my dog more than any person should." Margaret found herself smiling at that image. She could picture this lonely rancher having conversations with his dog. While he did his evening chores, Thomas wrote that he was looking for more than just someone to cook and clean. He wanted a true partner, someone to share the ups and downs of ranch life. Someone who could appreciate the beauty of mountain sunsets and wouldn't mind the isolation of living miles from the nearest neighbor. "I won't lie to you," the letter said. "Life out here is hard. Winters are cold and long, summer storms can be fierce. But there's something about this land that gets into your soul. On clear mornings when the sun comes up over the mountains, I feel like I can see forever. I'd like to share that feeling with someone who might understand it." Margaret read the letter 3 times before setting it down. This wasn't what she had expected from a frontier rancher. His words showed education and sensitivity. He wrote about feelings and beauty, not just practical matters. This was a man who thought about more than just cattle and weather. That evening, she began writing her reply. She told him about her life in Boston, carefully sticking to the story she had created. She wrote about missing her late husband and feeling lost in a big city where nobody really knew her. She described her love of reading and how she enjoyed watching sunrises from her small window. "I think I understand what you mean about the land getting into your soul," she wrote. "Even here in the city, I find peace in watching the sky change. Colors at dawn. I imagine those mountain sunrises must be truly magnificent." She mailed the letter the next day and began another anxious wait. This time, Thomas's reply came faster. He seemed pleased that she appreciated nature and could express herself well in writing. He told her more about his daily life on the ranch, describing the rhythm of caring for cattle, mending fences, and preparing for the changing seasons. "Most people think ranch work is simple," he wrote, "but it requires constant attention and planning. You have to understand your animals, read the weather, and always be thinking ahead. I suspect you would adapt well to this kind of life. Your letter shows you're someone who pays attention to details and thinks carefully about things." Margaret felt a warm glow when she read those words. When had anyone last complimented her intelligence or judgment? Robert had treated her like a decoration in their home, pretty but not particularly useful for important matters. Over the following weeks, their letters became longer and more personal. Thomas wrote about his dreams of expanding the ranch and maybe raising horses along with cattle. He described his small house and asked what changes she might want to make to feel comfortable there. "The house is simple but sturdy," he wrote. 2 bedrooms, a main room with a fireplace, and a kitchen with a wood stove. There's a front porch where I sit in the evenings and watch the stars. They're brighter out here than anything you've ever seen in the city. Sometimes I count them until I fall asleep in my chair." Margaret found herself looking forward to these evening star-counting sessions. She wrote back about her love of quiet moments and how she had always felt more peaceful away from crowds and noise. "I think I would enjoy those starry evenings," she told him. "In Boston, you can barely see the stars through all the smoke and lights. It sounds like your ranch is a place where a person could truly rest and think clearly." Their third exchange of letters brought even deeper sharing. Thomas wrote about losing his wife and baby and how the grief had nearly broken him. He explained that he wasn't looking for someone to replace what he had lost, but rather to build something new and different. "I learned that you can't hold on to the past too tightly," he wrote. "It will weigh you down until you can't move forward. I think you might understand this, having lost your husband and started over in a new place." Margaret did understand, perhaps better than Thomas knew. She was running from her past too, though her reasons were different from what she had told him. She wrote about her own grief and loneliness, describing feelings that were completely honest even if the details weren't entirely truthful. When she wrote about feeling invisible and unimportant, she was sharing her real heart. "Sometimes I wonder if I'll ever matter to anyone again," she confessed in one letter. "It's a terrible feeling to think you might spend the rest of your life being nobody special to nobody at all." Thomas's response to that letter arrived faster than any before it. "Dear Margaret," he wrote, using her first name for the first time. "You matter to me already and we haven't even met. Your letters are the best part of my days. When I see your handwriting on an envelope, I save it for evening when I can read it slowly by the fire. You write about thoughts and feelings that I have but never knew how to express. That makes you very special indeed." Reading those words, Margaret felt something she hadn't experienced in years. Someone cared about what she thought and felt. Someone looked forward to hearing from her. Someone thought she was special. But along with the joy came a growing weight of guilt. Every letter made her life feel heavier. Thomas was sharing his honest heart with her, while she was building their connection on a foundation of deception. The 8 years she had stolen felt like a wall between them. Even though he didn't know it existed. In their latest letters, Thomas had begun talking about the future. He mentioned wanting to meet her soon and possibly arranging their marriage before winter set in. He wrote about projects they could work on together and places he wanted to show her on the ranch. "I think we could build a good life together, Margaret," his last letter had said. "I feel like I know your heart from your letters, and I believe we could make each other happy. Would you be willing to come to Colorado Territory so we can meet in person?" Margaret stared at those words until they blurred. This kind, thoughtful man wanted to meet her. He was ready to offer her the new life she desperately needed. All she had to do was continue living the lie she had started. 8 years. Such a small number, but it felt enormous now. Every day she got older while pretending to be younger. Every letter from Thomas made the deception feel more wrong and more necessary at the same time. She had found something precious in these letters. A real connection with a good man. But that connection was built on lies that grew bigger with each passing day. Margaret knew she was walking toward a moment when the truth might destroy everything she was hoping to build. Still, she picked up her pen and began writing her reply. She would go to Colorado Territory. She would meet Thomas McKenna. And somehow, she would find a way to make up for the lies that had brought them together. The alternative was going back to that life of invisibility and desperation. And Margaret wasn't ready to give up on her second chance at happiness, even if that chance was built on borrowed time. The train ticket arrived with Thomas's latest letter, along with enough money for meals and a decent dress for their first meeting. Margaret stared at the ticket for a long time. Boston to Cedar Ridge, Colorado Territory. It looked like a ticket to another world. "I hope this covers your travel expenses," Thomas had written. "I wanted to make sure you could make the journey comfortably. I'm counting the days until we meet face to face. I have a good feeling about this, Margaret. I think we're going to build something wonderful together." Margaret packed her few belongings into the small suitcase. 2 dresses, some undergarments, a brush, and the small Bible that had belonged to her mother. Everything she owned in the world fit into one bag. It felt both sad and freeing at the same time. The night before leaving, she sat in her tiny room and practiced her story one more time. She had to remember she was 34, not 42. She had been married at 20 and widowed at 32. She spent 2 years grieving before deciding to start fresh in a new place. The lies felt smoother now after months of writing them in letters. Margaret had created a whole false history and memorized it like lines in a play. Sometimes she almost believed it herself. On the morning of departure, she took one last look at Boston from her boarding house window. Dirty streets, gray buildings, and smoke-filled air. She had been miserable here, but at least her misery had been honest. Now she was traveling toward happiness built on deception. The train station was crowded and noisy. Margaret had never traveled alone before, and everything felt overwhelming. Porters shouted directions, steam hissed from engines, and people hurried in all directions with their luggage. She found her train and climbed aboard with her suitcase. The seat was hard and narrow, but it was clean. Through the window, she watched Boston disappear as the train picked up speed. Every mile took her further from her old life and closer to her new one. The journey would take 3 days with stops in several cities. Margaret had brought bread and cheese to save money on meals. She watched the countryside roll by and tried to imagine what Colorado Territory would look like. On the first day, they traveled through farmland and small towns. The landscapes looked peaceful and prosperous. Margaret saw families working in fields and children playing in yards. It was a different world from the crowded, dirty city she was leaving behind. A woman about her age sat across the aisle with two young children. They chatted briefly, and the woman mentioned she was visiting her sister in Chicago. She looked at Margaret with curious eyes. "Traveling alone?" the woman asked. "That's unusual for a lady." "I'm going to meet my intended husband," Margaret replied, using the story she had prepared. "He's a rancher in Colorado Territory." "How exciting! A mail-order bride romance." Those stories always seem so adventurous. The woman smiled warmly. "I hope he's everything you've dreamed of." Margaret smiled back, but the words stung a little. If this stranger knew the truth about her age and circumstances, would she still think it was romantic? Or would she see it as a desperate woman clinging to her last chance? As the train rolled west, the landscape began to change. The neat farms gave way to wilder country. Hills became mountains in the distance. The air felt different when they stopped at stations. Cleaner and thinner. Margaret spent the long hours thinking about Thomas and trying to prepare for their first meeting. What if he took one look at her and knew she was older than she claimed? What if her letters had created expectations she couldn't meet in person? She pulled out a small mirror and studied her reflection. The worry lines around her eyes were deep, and her hair showed too much gray for a 34-year-old woman. Before leaving Boston, she had spent some of Thomas's money on hair dye to cover the gray. It helped, but she still looked like what? She was a woman who had lived through hard times. On the second day, they entered mountain country. Margaret pressed her face to the window and stared in wonder. She had never seen anything like these towering peaks covered in snow. The sky seemed bigger here, bluer and more open than anything she had known in Boston. At a station stop, she bought a sandwich and coffee from a vendor. The man who served her had weathered skin and kind eyes like she imagined Thomas might have. "First time in the mountains, ma'am?" he asked, noticing her amazed expression. "Yes, they're incredible. I had no idea they were so beautiful. Wait until you see them at sunrise," he said with a smile. "That's when they really show off." Margaret returned to her seat feeling more hopeful. If the country was this beautiful, surely the people would be good too. Maybe Thomas would be as kind and genuine as his letters suggested. But as the train climbed higher into the mountains, her nerves grew stronger. Tomorrow she would meet the man she might marry. Tomorrow her lies would be put to the test in person. She tried to sleep that night but kept waking as the train swayed around mountain curves. Each time she woke, she felt more anxious about what lay ahead. What if Thomas was disappointed in her? What if she couldn't keep up the pretense of being 8 years younger? What if he asked questions she wasn't prepared to answer? On the final morning, Margaret woke early and watched the sun rise over the mountain peaks. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. Golden light painted the snow-covered mountains in shades of pink and orange. The sight took her breath away and made her feel small, but also somehow part of something magnificent. Maybe this was what Thomas had meant in his letters about the land getting into your soul. Margaret could feel something changing inside her as she watched those mountains catch fire in the morning light. The train pulled into Cedar Ridge at noon. Margaret's heart pounded as she gathered her suitcase and prepared to step off. Through the window, she could see a small wooden station and a few buildings that made up the town. Mountains surrounded everything, making the settlement look tiny against their massive presence. She took a deep breath and walked to the train door. The conductor helped her down the steps, and suddenly she was standing on a wooden platform in Colorado Territory. The air was thin and crisp, so different from Boston's heavy atmosphere. Margaret looked around nervously. Several people waited on the platform, but she wasn't sure which one might be Thomas. Then she saw him. He stood near the station building, tall and lean with brown hair and the weathered face she had expected. But his eyes were gentle, and when he saw her looking around uncertainly, he smiled and stepped forward. "Margaret?" he said, and his voice was warm and hopeful. "Thomas?" she replied, and for a moment they just looked at each other. He was handsome in a quiet, steady way. His clothes were simple but clean, and his hands looked strong from ranch work. When he smiled, lines crinkled around his eyes in a way that made him seem trustworthy. "Welcome to Colorado territory," he said, taking her suitcase. "I hope the journey wasn't too difficult. It was long but beautiful. I've never seen mountains like these before." Thomas's smile grew wider. "Wait until you see them from the ranch. The view is even better there." As they walked toward a wagon hitched to two horses, Margaret felt both relief and terror. Relief because Thomas seemed exactly like his letters. Kind and genuine. Terror because that made her deception feel even worse. "I brought the wagon instead of riding," Thomas explained as he helped her up onto the seat. "Thought you might be tired from traveling." Margaret settled beside him, very aware of his presence. He smelled like horses and leather and clean mountain air. When he took the reins and guided the horses away from the station, she noticed how gently he handled them. "The ranch is about an hour's ride," he said as they left the small town behind. "I thought we could take our time and let you see the country." Margaret nodded, not trusting her voice. Now that she was actually here, sitting beside this good man who thought he knew her, the weight of her lies felt crushing. Every moment that passed made the deception deeper, but as they rode through valleys surrounded by snow-capped peaks, with clear streams running alongside the road and wildflowers blooming in mountain meadows, Margaret felt something she hadn't experienced in years. Hope, real, honest hope for the future. Maybe she could make this work. Maybe she could be the wife Thomas needed, regardless of her age. Maybe 8 years didn't matter as much as she feared. The wagon rolled on toward her. New life carrying Margaret toward either happiness or heartbreak. She wouldn't know which until the truth came out. The McKenna Ranch took Margaret's breath away. The house sat in a valley surrounded by rolling hills and backed by mountains that seemed to touch the sky. It was simple but beautiful, built from logs with a wide front porch just like Thomas had. Described in his letters, "Home," Thomas said softly as they approached, and Margaret could hear the pride in his voice. Cattle grazed peacefully in fenced pastures, and horses moved gracefully in a nearby corral. Everything looked well cared for and prosperous. This wasn't the rough, barely surviving operation Margaret had imagined. Thomas had built something solid and lasting here. "It's wonderful," she said, and meant it completely. Thomas helped her down from the wagon, his hands gentle and respectful. "Let me show you around," he said, picking up her suitcase. "I want you to feel comfortable here." The inside of the house was even better than Margaret had hoped. The main room had a stone fireplace and comfortable furniture made from local wood. Windows looked out on the mountains, and everything was clean and well organized. This was clearly the home of a man who took care of his possessions. "This will be your room," Thomas said, opening a door off the main room. "I hope it suits you." The bedroom was simple but pleasant, with a window that faced east toward the mountains. A quilt covered the bed, and a small dresser stood against one wall. It was the nicest room Margaret had slept in since losing her home in Boston. "It's perfect," she said, setting her suitcase on the bed. Thomas lingered in the doorway, suddenly seeming shy. "I thought we could take some time to get acquainted before we make any final decisions about marriage. I want you to be sure this is what you want?" Margaret looked at him in surprise. Most men in his situation would expect immediate marriage, especially after paying for her travel. The fact that he was giving her time to adjust showed a kindness that made her heart ache with guilt. "That's very thoughtful of you," she managed to say. "We'll plan the wedding for 6 weeks from now if all goes well," Thomas continued. "The circuit preacher comes through then, and it will give us time to be certain we suit each other." Over the following days, Margaret settled into ranch life with surprising ease. Thomas had been right about her ability to adapt. She cooked meals on the wood stove, helped with household tasks, and even learned to gather eggs from the chickens. But the best part was spending time with Thomas himself. He was everything his letters had promised and more. In the mornings, he would drink coffee on the porch and watch the sunrise paint the mountains in brilliant colors. He often asked Margaret to join him, and they would sit in comfortable silence or talk about the day ahead. "I never get tired of this view," Thomas said one morning, gesturing toward the peaks. "Every day looks different depending on the light and weather." Margaret sipped her coffee and watched golden light creep down the mountainsides. I can see why you love it here. It makes you feel like you're part of something bigger than yourself. Thomas turned to look at her with a smile that made her stomach flutter. You understand it. I hoped you would. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire and talk. Thomas was surprisingly well read for a rancher, with books on history and philosophy, mixed in with practical guides to cattle raising. He had traveled to Denver several times and could discuss politics and current events with intelligence. I may live in the middle of nowhere, he said one night, but I try not to let my mind get isolated too. A person needs to keep learning and growing no matter where they live. Margaret found herself sharing thoughts and opinions she had never expressed to anyone, not even her late husband. Thomas listened to everything she said with genuine interest, asking questions that showed he valued her ideas. You have a sharp mind, Margaret, he told her after a particularly long discussion about a book they had both read. I like that in a woman. Too many men want wives who just agree with everything they say. These conversations were both wonderful and torture for Margaret. Every moment of connection made her feel more guilty about the lies that had brought them together. Thomas was falling in love with her, and she was falling in love with him, but it was all built on a false foundation. The worst moments came when Thomas talked about their future together. He spoke about improvements he wanted to make to the house and ranch. He mentioned children and growing old together on the land he loved. I picture us sitting on this porch in 20 years, he said one evening, watching our grandchildren play in the yard while the sun sets behind those mountains. Margaret's heart clenched. 20 years from now, she would be over 60. Would Thomas still want her when he realized he was marrying a woman who might not have as many years to give him as he expected? The physical attraction between them was growing too. Thomas was respectful and never pushed for more than appropriate, but Margaret could feel the pull between them. When he helped her down from the wagon or their hands touched while passing dishes at dinner, she felt electricity that had nothing to do with age. You're a beautiful woman, Margaret, he said one evening as they watched stars appear in the clear mountain sky. More beautiful than I imagined from your letters. Margaret felt beautiful when he looked at her that way. For the first time in years, she felt desirable and valued. Thomas made her feel like she was worth loving, regardless of her age or circumstances. But that only made the deception harder to bear. 2 weeks into her stay, Margaret met some of the neighbors when Thomas took her to a community gathering at the local church. The nearest ranch family lived 5 miles away, but everyone seemed to know each other and genuinely care about their neighbors' well-being. So you're the mail-order bride we've been hearing about, said Mrs. Patterson, a friendly woman about Margaret's real age. Thomas has been so excited about your arrival. It's good to see him happy again. Margaret smiled and made polite conversation, but she noticed Mrs. Patterson studying her with sharp eyes. Did the woman suspect something about her age? Margaret had dyed her hair again and tried to dress youthfully, but she wondered if people could still tell she was older than she claimed. You seem very mature for your age, Mrs. Patterson commented later. Must come from being widowed young? That kind of experience ages a person? Yes, Margaret agreed quickly. Losing my husband changed me quite a lot. That night, Thomas told her how pleased he was with how well she had gotten along with everyone. They all like you already, he said. Mrs. Patterson said, you seem like exactly the kind of sensible woman I need. Sensible. The word stung because Margaret knew how foolish she was being. A sensible woman would tell the truth and trust that real love could overcome a few years' difference in age. But fear kept her silent. As the weeks passed, Margaret fell deeper in love with both Thomas and the life they were building together. She loved the peaceful rhythm of ranch days, the spectacular beauty of the mountain setting, and most of all, the gentle strength of the man who wanted to marry her. Thomas showed her every aspect of ranch operation, from caring for sick cattle to mending fences. He valued her opinions and often asked for her suggestions about improvements or problems. Margaret realized he truly wanted a partner, not just a housekeeper. You have good instincts about the animals, he told her after she correctly identified A cow that was getting sick? I think you're going to be a real asset to this operation. But every compliment and every sign of his growing love made Margaret's guilt heavier. Thomas was planning a life with a woman who didn't really exist. The real Margaret was 8 years older and carrying secrets that might change everything. The wedding was now only 3 weeks away. Thomas had started making preparations, talking to the preacher and planning a simple ceremony on the ranch. He was so happy and excited that Margaret could barely stand to look at him sometimes. I keep thinking I must be dreaming, he told her one evening as they sat on the porch. After being alone for so long, I can hardly believe I'm about to marry a woman like you. Margaret forced herself to smile and tried to ignore the voice in her head that screamed for her to tell him the truth. She was in too deep now. The lies had become part of their story, woven into every conversation and shared moment, but late at night, lying alone in her bed, Margaret would stare at the ceiling and wonder how long she could keep living this deception. Love built on lies couldn't last forever. Eventually the truth would come out, and when it did, it might destroy the best thing that had ever happened to her. Still, she wasn't ready to risk losing Thomas and this new life. Not yet. Maybe after they were married and he truly loved her, the 8 years wouldn't matter as much. Maybe she could find a way to tell him gradually. Or maybe he would never need to know at all. Margaret knew she was fooling herself, but she wasn't ready to stop. The alternative was losing everything she had found here, and she had already lost too much in her life. 3 weeks until the wedding. 3 weeks to decide whether to confess or continue living the lie that had given her this chance at happiness. 2 weeks before the wedding, Thomas's sister Catherine arrived from Denver for an extended visit. Margaret knew from Thomas's letters that Catherine was a school teacher, unmarried at 35 and very protective of her younger brother. What she hadn't expected was how sharp and observant Catherine would be. "So you're the mysterious bride-to-be," Catherine said when Thomas introduced them. She was a tall, thin woman with intelligent gray eyes that seemed to see everything. "Thomas has written so much about you. I'm eager to get acquainted." Margaret felt immediately uncomfortable under Catherine's steady gaze. Where Thomas looked at her with love and acceptance, Catherine studied her like she was solving a puzzle. "I'm pleased to meet you," Margaret replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "Thomas has told me wonderful things about his sister." Over the next few days, Catherine watched Margaret constantly. She asked questions that seemed innocent but felt like tests. How long had Margaret been widowed? What was her late husband's full name? What part of Boston had she lived in? Margaret answered carefully, sticking to the story she had created. But she could feel Catherine's suspicion growing with each conversation. "You seem very experienced for someone your age," Catherine observed one afternoon as they prepared vegetables for dinner. "Most women of 34 haven't had to handle as many difficult situations as you describe." "Being widowed young forces you to grow up quickly," Margaret replied, hoping her voice sounded natural. Double quotes. "Yes, I suppose it would." Catherine continued, "Peeling potatoes with methodical precision. Though you carry yourself like someone who's seen even more of life than that would account for." Margaret's hands trembled slightly as she chopped carrots. Did Catherine suspect her real age? Or was she just naturally suspicious of any woman who wanted to marry her brother? That evening, Margaret overheard Catherine talking quietly to Thomas on the front porch. "Are you certain you know enough about her background?" Catherine was saying. "It seems rushed to marry someone you've only known through letters and a few weeks in person." "I know everything I need to know," Thomas replied firmly. "Margaret is kind, intelligent, and hardworking. She makes me happy, Catherine. Isn't that enough? I just want you to be careful. Some women aren't honest about their circumstances when they answer marriage advertisements. They might have reasons for wanting to leave their old lives behind." Margaret's blood turned cold. Catherine was getting dangerously close to the truth. "Margaret has been completely honest with me," Thomas said, and the confidence in his voice made Margaret's guilt burn even stronger. "I trust her completely." The conversation moved inside before Margaret could hear more, but the damage was done. Catherine suspected something, and her presence was making it impossible for Margaret to feel comfortable in what should have been her new home. The next day, things got worse. At the weekly community gathering, Margaret met several families she hadn't encountered before. Most were friendly and welcoming, but she noticed people studying her carefully and whispering among themselves. "She looks older than 34, she heard one woman murmur to another. "Mail-order brides sometimes lie about their age," came the reply. "Poor Thomas, he's so trusting." Margaret pretended not to hear, but her face burned with shame. If neighbors were already suspicious, how long before someone voiced their doubts directly to Thomas? Mrs. Patterson approached her with a concerned expression. "Dear, I hope you don't mind me saying, but some folks are wondering about your background. Small communities can be protective of their own." "I understand," Margaret managed to say. "I hope in time people will get to know the real me." "I'm sure they will," Mrs. Patterson said kindly. "It's just that Thomas went through so much pain when he lost his first wife. People want to make sure he's not being taken advantage of." That night, Margaret lay awake staring at the ceiling. The walls felt like they were closing in around her. Catherine's suspicions, the neighbors' whispers, and her own crushing guilt were making it impossible to enjoy the life she had worked so hard to build. She got up and lit a candle, then sat at the small table in her room to write. Maybe if she could get her thoughts down on paper, she could figure out what to do. "Dear Thomas," she began, then stopped. How could she possibly explain 8 years of lies in a letter? How could she make him understand that everything real between them had grown from something false? She crumpled up the paper and started again. "I need to tell you something important about my past. Again she stopped. The words looked so stark and frightening on paper. Once she wrote them down and gave them to Thomas, there would be no taking them back. Margaret tried 5 more times to write a confession letter. Each time she got a few sentences in before fear overwhelmed her and she tore up the paper. What if Thomas felt so betrayed that he sent her away immediately? Where would she go? How would she survive? But keeping the secret was becoming unbearable too. Every time Thomas looked at her with love and trust, she felt like she was stabbing him in the heart. Every time he made plans for their future together, she wondered if she was stealing years from him that he thought he would have. The worst moment came 3 days later when Thomas took her to visit his wife's grave. It was in a small cemetery behind the local church, marked with a simple wooden cross. "Elizabeth Ann McKenna," Thomas read from the headstone. "Beloved wife and mother." She was 26 when she died, just a young girl, really. He knelt and placed wildflowers on the grave. "I want you to know about her because she was important to me, but I also want you to know that what we have is different. I'm not trying to replace her. I'm building something new with you." Margaret stood beside him, fighting back tears. Thomas was being completely honest about his past while she continued to live a lie about hers. The contrast made her feel sick with shame. "She would have liked you," Thomas continued, standing and taking Margaret's hand. "You both have that same quiet strength. The ability to face hard things and keep going. If only he knew how hard things really were and how close she was to breaking under the weight of her deception." That afternoon, Catherine cornered Margaret in the kitchen while Thomas was out checking on the cattle. "I know there's something you're not telling my brother," Catherine said without preamble. "I can see it in your eyes every time someone asks about your past." Margaret's heart pounded, but she tried to keep her voice steady. "I don't know what you mean." "I think you do." Catherine moved closer, her gray eyes intense. "Thomas is a good man who deserves an honest wife. Whatever you're hiding, he has a right to know before he marries you." "I'm not hiding anything," Margaret lied, hating herself for the words. "Then you won't mind if I write to some contacts I have in Boston? Just to verify the details of your story?" Margaret felt the blood drain from her face. If Catherine investigated her background, she would discover not only the age discrepancy, but also the debts and desperate circumstances that had driven her west. "Why would you do that?" Margaret asked weakly. "Because I love my brother, and I won't stand by and watch him be deceived." Catherine's voice was hard but not unkind. If you're truly who you say you are, then my inquiries won't hurt anything. But if you're lying about something important, Thomas deserves to know. After Catherine left the kitchen, Margaret sat down heavily in a chair. Her carefully constructed new life was crumbling around her. Catherine's investigation would expose everything, and when it did, Thomas would learn the truth in the worst possible way. That night at dinner, Margaret could barely eat. Thomas noticed her distress and asked if she was feeling well. "Just nervous." "About the wedding," she managed to say. "That's natural," Thomas said gently, reaching over to squeeze her hand. "I'm nervous too. It's a big step we're taking." Catherine watched this exchange with sharp eyes, and Margaret could see the wheels turning in her mind. Every affectionate gesture between them probably convinced Catherine that her brother was being manipulated by a dishonest woman. After Catherine went to bed, Thomas and Margaret sat on the porch as they did every evening. But tonight, the comfortable silence felt heavy with unspoken truths. "Catherine seems concerned about something," Thomas said eventually. "Has she said anything to upset you?" Margaret longed to tell him everything right then, to confess her lies and trust that his love was strong enough to forgive her deception, but fear kept her silent. "She's just being protective," Margaret said. "It's natural for her to worry about you. I suppose so." Thomas was quiet for a long moment. "Margaret, you know you can tell me anything, don't you? If something from your past is troubling you, I want to help." The opening was there. Thomas was practically begging her to be honest with him. But Margaret couldn't find the courage to take it. "Everything's fine," she whispered, adding one more lie to the pile that threatened to crush them both. 10 days until the wedding. 10 days before Catherine's investigation might expose her, or 10 days to find the courage to tell Thomas the truth herself. Margaret knew she was running out of time, but she still didn't know if she was brave enough to risk losing the only happiness she had found in years. The secret was killing her slowly, but the truth might destroy everything instantly. Either way, she couldn't keep living in this terrible middle ground much longer. 3 days before the wedding, Margaret's carefully constructed world came crashing down in the most unexpected way. She was in the general store in Cedar Ridge with Thomas, picking out fabric for new curtains for their home. It was supposed to be a happy occasion, one of their final preparations before becoming husband and wife. Margaret had been trying to push aside her anxiety and enjoy the moment when a gruff voice behind them changed everything. "Well, I'll be damned if it isn't Margaret Whitmore." Margaret's blood turned to ice. She turned slowly to see a weathered man in a traveling merchant's coat, his wagon loaded with goods parked outside the store. She recognized him immediately. Though she had hoped never to see him again, Frank Morrison had been one of her late husband's gambling associates in Boston. He had also been one of the creditors demanding payment after Robert's death. Margaret remembered him standing in her parlor, making veiled threats about what happened to people who didn't honor their debts. "Morrison," she said weakly, her voice barely a whisper. Thomas looked between them with confusion. "You two know each other?" "Know each other?" Morrison laughed, but there was no humor in it. "I should say so. Mrs. Whitmore here owes me quite a bit of money. Her husband had some bad luck at the poker table, if you know what I mean." Margaret felt the store spinning around her. Other customers had stopped their shopping to listen, drawn by the tension in Morrison's voice. "I'm afraid you have me confused with someone else," Margaret said desperately. Morrison stepped closer, his eyes hard and calculating. "Oh no, I'd know that face anywhere. Though you're looking better than when I last saw you in that flop house in Boston. Found yourself a rich rancher, have you? Smart woman." Thomas moved protectively in front of Margaret, his jaw tight. "I think you need to be more careful about your accusations, friend." "Accusations?" Morrison pulled out a small notebook and flipped through pages. "Let me see here. Robert Whitmore died February 1885. Owed me $300. Wife was—" He squinted at his notes. 40-2 years old at the time of his death. That would make her, what, about 43 now? The words hit the store like a thunderclap. Margaret heard gasps from the other customers and felt Thomas go rigid beside her. 43? Thomas said slowly, turning to look at Margaret with confusion and dawning hurt in his eyes. Now that's interesting, Morrison continued, clearly enjoying the drama he had created. Because this lady here told everyone she was 34. That's quite a mistake to make about your own age, wouldn't you say? Margaret wanted to run, to disappear, to be anywhere but standing in that store watching Thomas's face change as he realized the magnitude of her deception. But her feet felt rooted to the floor. Margaret? Thomas's voice was quiet, but she could hear the pain in it. Is this true? She opened her mouth, but no words came out. How could she possibly explain 8 years of lies in front of a store full of strangers? Morrison wasn't finished. Oh, it gets better. Last time I saw Mrs. Whitmore, she was living in the worst part of Boston, couldn't even afford decent lodging. Desperate woman, she was. I imagine she'd do just about anything to get out of that situation. That's enough, Thomas said sharply, but Margaret could see the doubt creeping into his eyes. Just thought you should know what kind of woman you're dealing with, Morrison said with false concern. Mail-order brides can be tricky that way. They don't always tell the whole truth about their circumstances. The store had gone completely silent except for the sound of Margaret's ragged breathing. She could feel everyone staring at her, judging her, seeing her for what she really was, a desperate woman, who had built her second chance on lies. Thomas took her arm gently but firmly. Come on, Margaret, we're leaving. The ride back to the ranch was the longest of Margaret's life. Thomas didn't say a single word, just stared straight ahead while the wagon bounced over the familiar road. Margaret sat beside him in misery, knowing. But everything between them had changed in those few terrible minutes when they reached the house. Thomas helped her down from the wagon without meeting her eyes. Catherine appeared on the porch, took one look at their faces, and wisely disappeared back inside. Thomas walked to the corral and stood with his back to the house, staring out at the mountains. Margaret knew he was trying to process what he had. Learned, trying to understand how the woman he loved could have deceived him so completely, she waited on the porch, giving him time to think. The afternoon sun was setting behind the peaks, painting the sky in the brilliant colors she had come to love. But the beauty felt hollow now, tainted by the knowledge that her time here was probably ending. Finally, as full darkness settled over the valley, Thomas came back to the house. He looked older than she had ever seen him, worn down by betrayal and confusion. Inside, he said quietly, we need to talk. They sat across from each other at the kitchen table where they had shared so many comfortable meals and conversations. The lamp cast a warm glow between them, but the distance felt vast. Is it true? Thomas asked finally. Are you really 43 years old? Margaret nodded, unable to speak. So you've been lying to me from the very beginning. In every letter, every conversation, every moment we've spent together. Not about everything, Margaret whispered. My feelings for you are real. Everything I told you about caring for you, about wanting to build a life together, that was all true. Thomas's laugh was bitter. How can I believe anything you say? Now, if you lied about something as basic as your age, what else have you been hiding? The question opened the floodgates. Through tears, Margaret told him everything. About Robert's gambling debts, about the men who had threatened her, about the boarding house and her desperate circumstances. She explained how she had seen his advertisement as her only chance at survival, and how the lie about her age had started as a small deception but grown into something that consumed her with guilt. I wanted to tell you, she said through her sobs. So many times I almost confessed everything. But I was so afraid of losing you, of losing this life we were building together. Thomas listened without interruption, his face a mask of pain and disappointment. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. 8 years, Margaret. You stole 8 years from me. I know it was wrong, but please try to understand how desperate I was. I had nothing left, nowhere to go. I thought if I could just get here, if you could get to know the real me, maybe the age wouldn't matter so much. The real you? Thomas's voice was sharp. I don't even know who the real you is anymore. How can I trust anything when our entire relationship started with a lie? Margaret reached across the table toward him, but he pulled his hands away. The rejection cut deeper than any words could have. "I'm still the same person you fell in love with," she pleaded. "I'm still the woman who watches sunrises with you and talks about books by the fire. The age doesn't change who I am inside." "It changes everything," Thomas said heavily. "It changes how much time we might have together. It changes whether we could have children. It changes the fact that you were willing to build our entire future on deception." They sat in silence as the truth settled between them like a wall. Margaret could see Thomas struggling with his emotions, trying to reconcile the woman he loved with the lies she had told. "What am I supposed to do now?" he asked finally. "The wedding is in 3 days. People are coming from all over the territory. How do I explain that my bride-to-be has been living a lie?" "I don't know," Margaret whispered. "I never thought beyond getting here and hoping for the best." Thomas stood up abruptly and walked to the window, looking out at the dark mountains. "I need time to think about this. I need to figure out if there's any way to move forward from here. Are you going to send me away?" Margaret asked, her voice breaking. Thomas was quiet for so long that Margaret thought he wouldn't answer. Finally, he spoke without turning around. "I don't know. I honestly don't know if I can ever trust you again. And without trust, what kind of marriage would we have?" Margaret felt her world collapsing around her. She had found love, real love, and her own lies were destroying it. The worst part was that she couldn't blame Thomas for his anger and hurt. She had betrayed him in the deepest possible way. "I'll sleep in the barn tonight," Thomas said finally. "We both need space to think about this." He walked toward the door, then stopped with his hand on the handle. "For what it's worth, Margaret, I did love you. I love the woman I thought you were. I just don't know if that's enough anymore." After he left, Margaret sat alone at the table and cried until she had no tears left. She had gambled everything on 8 years of stolen time, and now she was going to lose it all anyway. The truth had set her free, but freedom felt like dying. Margaret didn't sleep that night. She sat by her bedroom window watching the mountains slowly emerge from darkness as dawn approached. Every few minutes she glanced toward the barn where Thomas had spent the night, wondering if he was lying. Awake too, trying to sort through the mess she had made of their lives. Catherine had remained tactfully silent the evening before, but Margaret could feel her presence in the house like a reminder of all the doubts that had been proven right. Thomas's sister had known something was wrong, and now she was probably wondering how to help her brother pick up the pieces. As the sun painted the mountain peaks pink and gold, Margaret made a decision. She couldn't stay here and force Thomas to face the painful choice of what to do with her. The kindest thing she could do was remove herself from his life and let him heal from her betrayal. She began packing her few belongings into the same small suitcase she had brought from Boston. 2 dresses, some undergarments, her mother's Bible, and the little money she had left from what Thomas had sent for her journey. It wasn't much to show for a life, but it was all she had. Margaret was folding her nightgown when she heard the front door open. Heavy footsteps crossed the main room and stopped outside her bedroom door. A gentle knock made her heart leap with hope and dread. "Margaret, may I come in?" Thomas's voice sounded tired but calm. Margaret set down her nightgown and opened the door. He looked like he hadn't slept either. His hair was disheveled, his clothes wrinkled from sleeping in the barn, and his eyes were red-rimmed with exhaustion. But something in his expression had changed from the anger and hurt of the night before. "You're packing," he observed, looking at the open suitcase on her bed. "I thought it would be easier if I just left," Margaret said quietly. "You shouldn't have to decide what to do with me. I'll find a way to get back to Denver and figure out my life from there." Thomas stepped into the room and closed the door behind him. "Sit down, Margaret, please." She perched on the edge of the bed while he took the single chair by the window. For a moment they just looked at each other in the morning light streaming through the glass. "I spent the night thinking," Thomas began. "About us, about the lies, about what it all means. I was angry at first. Hurt and betrayed and ready to put you on the next train east." Margaret nodded, tears already starting to blur her vision. "I understand. I don't blame you for feeling that way. But then I started thinking about something else," Thomas continued. I thought about my first marriage, about Elizabeth and what we had together. Margaret wasn't sure where he was going with this, but she listened carefully to every word. Elizabeth and I had a good marriage, but it was simple in some ways. We were both young, both from the same small community. We liked each other, our families approved, and we never had to face any real challenges together before she died. Thomas stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the familiar view of mountains and valleys. What we've built together in these past weeks feels different, deeper somehow. The woman I've gotten to know, the real you underneath the lies about your age, she's someone who's faced real hardship and survived it. Someone who knows what loss feels like and still has the courage to hope for better. Margaret felt a flicker of hope but tried not to let it grow too strong. Thomas might be working through his feelings, but that didn't mean he could forgive her deception. I keep thinking about our conversations by the fire, Thomas said, turning back to face her. The way you understood things about life and loss that someone who was really 34 probably wouldn't know. The depth in your eyes when you talked about difficult times. I think part of me always knew you were older than you claimed. Then why didn't you say anything? Margaret asked. Because it didn't matter to me. What mattered was how you made me feel, how you challenged my thinking, how you brought life back to this house. Age is just numbers, Margaret. What we have together is real connection. Margaret felt her heart starting to race. Was Thomas saying what she thought he was saying? I'm still hurt by the lies, he continued. I won't pretend otherwise. Trust is important in a marriage, and you've damaged ours before it even began. Margaret's hope deflated again. I know, I'm so sorry, Thomas. I never meant for it to go this far. But, Thomas said, holding up a hand to stop her apology, I also understand why you did it. You were desperate and alone, facing a future that probably seemed worse than death. You made a choice that seemed like your only option for survival. He moved closer to the bed and sat down beside her, careful to leave some space between them. Here's what I realized while I was lying awake in that barn. I'd rather have an honest relationship with a 43-year-old woman who loves me than a dishonest one with someone who was pretending to be younger. The question is, can you be completely honest with me from now on? Margaret turned to face him fully, seeing something in his eyes that looked like forgiveness beginning to form. Yes, she said firmly, absolutely yes. I'm so tired of carrying these lies, Thomas. I want to tell you everything about my real life, my real past, my real fears and hopes. No more pretending. Thomas nodded slowly. That's what I needed to hear. Because the woman I fell in love with, the one who watches sunrises and quotes Shakespeare and knows how to gentle a spooked horse, that woman is real regardless of her age. And I'm not ready to lose her over 8 years that don't change who she is inside. Margaret couldn't believe what she was hearing. Are you saying? Are you willing to try to work through this? I'm saying I love you, Margaret. Not the 34-year-old version you created, but the real 43-year-old woman sitting next to me right now? The one who's survived more than most people, twice her age, and still has kindness in her heart. The tears came then, but they were tears of relief and gratitude rather than despair. Thomas reached over and took her hands in his. I can't promise it will be easy, he said. We'll have to rebuild trust, and that takes time. But if you're willing to be completely honest with me from this moment forward, I'm willing to try. What about the wedding? Margaret asked. It's supposed to be tomorrow. Thomas was quiet for a moment, considering. We'll postpone it. Give ourselves time to get reacquainted as who we really are. When we do marry, if we do marry, it will be without any lies between us. Margaret squeezed his hands tightly. I don't deserve your forgiveness. Maybe not, Thomas said with a small smile. But love isn't about deserving. It's about choosing to build something good together despite our flaws and mistakes. He stood up and walked back to the window, looking out at the ranch spread below them. You know what convinced me more than anything? It was remembering something you said last week about making the most of whatever time we have. You said life is too short to waste on regrets and fears. I realize that applies to this situation too. Thomas turned back to her with an expression that was serious but no longer angry. 8 years, Margaret. You lied about 8 years. But if we have any real chance at happiness together, I'd rather spend it focused on the years ahead of us than dwelling on the ones that don't exist. The choice is yours. Do you want to run away again, or do you want to stay and build something real? Margaret looked at this man who was offering her forgiveness she didn't deserve and a second chance. She had thought was lost forever, she thought. About all the running she had done in her life, all the times she had let fear make her choices for her. I want to stay, she said firmly. I want to build something real with you, Thomas. Something based on complete honesty and truth. Then unpack your bag, Thomas said, and for the first time since the scene in the store, he smiled. We have work to do. As Margaret began taking her clothes back out of the suitcase, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years, hope based on truth instead of deception. It would be a long road back to trust, but Thomas was willing to walk it with her. For the first time since arriving in Colorado territory, Margaret felt like she could really breathe. The lies were finally over, and whatever came next would be built on the solid foundation of who they really were. 3 months later, Margaret stood on the front porch of the McKenna Ranch watching the sun rise over the mountains. The view was as breathtaking as ever, but now she could enjoy it without the weight of secrets pressing down on her shoulders. Thomas emerged from the house carrying 2 cups of coffee, a morning ritual they had maintained even through the difficult weeks of rebuilding their relationship. "Penny for your thoughts?" he said, settling into the chair beside her. Margaret accepted the coffee gratefully and smiled. "I was thinking about how different everything feels now. The same mountains, the same sunrise, but I can actually see it clearly instead of through a fog of lies. The months since the truth came out had been challenging but healing. True to his word, Thomas had postponed their wedding indefinitely while they worked to establish trust and honest communication. It hadn't been easy. There were days when the hurt in Thomas's eyes made Margaret wonder if they would ever truly recover from her deception, but slowly, carefully, they had built something new together, something stronger than what they'd had before because it was based on complete truth. The community had been harder to win over. News of Margaret's real age and circumstances had spread quickly through Cedar Ridge and the surrounding ranches. Some people were understanding, recognizing the desperate situation that had driven her to deception. Others were judgmental, whispering that she had taken advantage of Thomas's trusting nature. Catherine had been surprisingly supportive once the truth was out. "I knew something was wrong," she told Margaret privately, "but I have to admit, watching how you two handle this crisis has shown me more about your character than months of perfect behavior would have." The hardest part had been Margaret's own guilt and self-doubt. Even as Thomas worked to forgive her, she struggled to forgive herself. It was Thomas who finally helped her move past the shame. "You made a mistake born out of desperation," he told her one evening as they sat by the fire. "But you're not the same person who wrote that first letter. You've grown, you've changed, you've chosen honesty even when it was terrifying. That's who you are now, and that's who I love." Now 3 months later, they had found their rhythm as partners who truly knew each other. Margaret had told Thomas everything about her life in Boston, her marriage to Robert, the debts and threats that had driven her west. In return, Thomas had shared stories about his childhood, his dreams for the ranch, and his fears about opening his heart again after losing his first wife. "I have something to ask you," Thomas said, setting down his coffee cup and turning to face her. Margaret felt her heart skip, but not from fear this time. Over the past weeks, she had sensed Thomas building towards something important. "Margaret Whitmore," he said, taking her hands in his, "I want to ask you to marry me. Not the 34-year-old woman I thought I was writing to, but the real 43-year-old woman sitting here beside me, the one who survived loss and hardship and still has love to give." Margaret felt tears start in her eyes, but they were tears of joy. "Are you sure? Really sure? Because I need you to understand what you're choosing. I might not be able to give you children. I might not have as many years ahead of me as a younger woman would." Thomas smiled and cupped her face gently in his hands. "Margaret, listen to me carefully because this is the most important thing I'll ever say to you." He looked directly into her eyes, his voice clear and certain. I would rather have 10 honest years with you than 50 with someone who isn't. Really there? Age doesn't define love. Connection does. Understanding does. The way you make me laugh when I'm discouraged. The way you see beauty in things I take for granted. The way you challenge me to be better than I am. That's what matters. Margaret felt something heal inside her chest. A part of her heart that had been broken since the day Robert died and left her with nothing. You've taught me something important, Thomas continued. Love isn't about counting years or measuring time. It's about making every moment count, regardless of how many we have. A life shared with the right person is rich, whether it's 10 years or 50. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a simple gold ring. This was my grandmother's. It's not fancy, but it's been worn by women who understood that real love transcends everything else. Age, circumstances, even mistakes. Margaret looked at the ring through her tears. It was beautiful in its simplicity, worn smooth by years of being worn by hands that had worked hard and loved deeply. Will you marry me, Margaret? Will you be my wife, my partner, my companion for whatever years we have together? Margaret didn't hesitate. Yes, yes, absolutely yes. Thomas slipped the ring onto her finger, and it fit perfectly. They sat together on the porch, holding hands and watching the morning light spread across the valley, both of them feeling like they were finally where they belonged. When? Margaret asked. Soon, Thomas said. I don't want to wait any longer than necessary. We've wasted enough time on fear and secrets. I want to start our real life together. 2 weeks later, they were married in a simple ceremony on the ranch. The circuit preacher performed the service on the front porch with the mountains as their backdrop. Catherine stood as Margaret's witness, and several neighbors attended despite the gossip that still circulated about Margaret's past. But what Margaret remembered most about that day was the moment when Thomas spoke his vows. Looking directly into her eyes, he said words that would stay with her forever. Margaret, I promise to love you not despite your age or your past, but because of everything that made you who you are. I promise that our love will make time irrelevant. Whether we have 10 years or 50, every day will feel like a gift because we're living it honestly together. Margaret's own vows were simpler but just as heartfelt. Thomas, I promise to be completely honest with you from this day forward. I promise to love you with all the wisdom that my years have given me, and to make every moment of our marriage count. The years that followed proved Thomas right about love transcending time. Their marriage was deeper and